All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us. I'm Jenna Kirsten, a member of the marketing team here at Kirkpatrick Price, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's session on cloud security, where we'll be discussing business continuity and disaster recovery plans. We know there's tons of cloud security info out there, and we're grateful that you chose us today. Let's go over a couple of things before we dive into our discussion. All attendees will be muted throughout the session, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature, which is located in the WebEx toolbar. I will monitor those throughout the hour and have some time reserved at the end to answer those. This session is also being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slides in your inbox tomorrow. Just a little bit of background about who we are before we get started. Kirkpatrick Price is a licensed CPA firm providing assurance services to clients worldwide. Our firm has over 13 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance control. We offer both regulatory compliance and information security services. We provide consulting services such as policy and procedure drafting, risk assessment, internal audit plan and development, and readiness audits. We also provide guidance and audit services on frameworks such as SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC for cybersecurity, PCI, HIPAA, HITRUST, FISMA, ISO, and GDPR. We also encourage you to connect with us by subscribing to our blog, visiting our library of on-demand webinars, and following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Now I'd like to welcome our speaker for today, Michael Burke. He is an information security specialist here at Kirkpatrick Price and has a wide range of experience across IT disciplines. Not only does he have a PhD, but he also has CISSP, CCISO, QSA, and HITRUST practitioner certifications. Welcome, Michael. Michael, if you're talking, you might be on mute. We don't hear you yet.
And so you know me so well, Jenna. Thank you so much. And I have lots of great conversations with my muted phone. So thank you to everybody, and thank you, Jenna, for that wonderful introduction and for getting us started. And thank you to everybody for taking the time out to talk about disaster recovery and business continuity plans. So a little bit of housekeeping here. Something that our lawyers make us say. So the presentation provided by Kirkpatrick Price is for educational and/or informational purposes and does not constitute legal advice. So no attorney-client relationship is established by viewing the presentation. And should you need legal advice, please consult with your attorney. So with that out of business, I think we should probably record that in that super fast voice so that we can get these presentations moving quickly. But so let's talk about the objective of this presentation. Business continuity and disaster recovery plans are really important, and we all know that they're important, but now suddenly we have this disruptive force in the cloud. So how does that influence our activities when it comes to business continuity and disaster recovery? So let's talk a little bit about what we're gonna say. By no means can we cover everything that is possibly part of a business continuity and disaster recovery plan in the hour that we have scheduled. But this is more along the lines of, this is food for thought. Where do we start? We have a business continuity plan. So what is it and what it isn't with regard to the cloud? How do I test my plans and why do I test my plans? The cloud changes things a little bit. So let's talk about those things. Lessons learned. I think it's important that the listeners hear some of the things that we're hearing from a compliance perspective. and how that relates to what they're doing to achieve those compliance objectives. And again, that brings up those issues of regulatory issues for your approach. Some things could happen. You could have a great approach, but you may have some wrinkle that is introduced by a particular regulatory requirement. So as I talked about what I'm hearing, so on more than 10 occasions, I've heard things like, I'm in the cloud. I don't have to worry about business continuity and disaster recovery plans because insert name of cloud provider. They take care of everything for me, and I'm not going to have to worry about it. So there's some pretty big issues at that point. We start looking at what it is that you're required to do, and what you're not required to do when it comes to the risk models and how you would recover from a disaster. So there's a couple of things that I want to make sure that we cover, kind of to get everybody's mindset on the same page. So let's define what we're talking about. So very often I'm hearing those things about the cloud provider is taking care of it for me. And your business continuity plan is that. It is a business continuity plan. Not so much about the technology roadmap and how we're going to recover bits and bytes and what server we're going to put them on. A lot of times it has things to do with how am I going to continue to operate my business. So there's a little bit of a difference in how we have to think about that. And this is where I'm talking about the food for thought. I would like everybody to really address their business continuity plans and look at not so much from a technology perspective, because the technology is easy. It's the business that makes it a little bit more difficult. It's the people. So, let's look at 9/11. 9/11 changed the way a lot of us think. A lot of those businesses didn't cease to operate based on their technology initiatives. A lot of them ceased to operate on their people initiatives. So we have to look at that as a possibility that something bad could influence how you're delivering those processes to those individuals looking for those single points of failure. That's really a separate topic than this, and it's kind of add-on, but again, this is food for thought. So we're trying to get everybody to just really think through their processes. And, the way I look at business continuity and disaster recovery, you have backup strategies and how are we going to put more technology in, but it's really a chair. You have the legs of the chair where you have backups, and then you have infrastructure, and then you have people, and then you have risk analysis, because that's the important piece of making sure that the legs of the chair are all entirely at the same floor. So not one is longer than the other, and it's I'm sorry, I know there was a little bit of a lag there. So from an audit perspective, when we're evaluating compliance, these disaster recovery plans, we're going to look at those for your SOC 1 and SOC 2 reports in both of the ISO certifications that you possibly get. In NIST 853, 871, that's an important. High trust, and of course HIPAA as an addition to that. Your PCI compliance, backups are important there, and particularly with the cloud, there's some pitfalls that potentially could happen with PCI data, as well as GDPR, as we're all waiting for the legislation in the EU to really define what GDPR data is. And, you know, from organizations, particularly that put data in the cloud, that may be European data, because some of our cloud providers have European regions that legislation is now subject. So the shared responsibility model, you may, for people actually viewed one of our other webinars with Randy Bartels, this is actually taken from the good, the bad, and the ugly from cloud security. So I borrowed this slide from him because I thought this was particularly pertinent to talk about. If you haven't viewed that particular webinar, I would suggest that you take a look and listen. There's some really good content there. So, you know, we talked about the regulatory requirements and some of your industry requirements, and really that business requirement that is driving your disaster recovery plan. So we stick them all into this funnel, and out at the end, we end up with some security requirements. So the security requirements that you end up with are those are your objectives. And now you're going to evaluate your risks based on meeting those objectives. So we drive that backwards, and if we look at it from particularly like from the NIST 800-34 plan for business continuity, and then we can then look at it from like FIPS 199 and say FIPS 199 says we should evaluate these risks, and let's score these risks, and then move that through and look at it from the perspective of the NIST 853 in all the CP groups for business continuity. So you can see that all of these regulatory frameworks, not really requirements, but frameworks, offer you some guidance for that. But the security requirements are what end up to be your objectives. So now we have what we're trying to get to. And as you see on the right and the left, on one side is the cloud and one side is the customer. So if we go back and we remember the customers or the clients that are saying, I don't have to do anything. It's all in the cloud and they take care of it for me. Well, that's not necessarily true. They take care of some of your things, not all of them. And we have to define where we are so that we know. So here's some more of the things that I get to hear when I'm talking to some of our clients. We don't need to test our plan because they've thought it all through, or they've read on an industry website, cloud service provider industry website, that all of those things are taken care of. Very often we confuse availability zones with, or operating regions with things that are going to protect us. Again, that's the whole thing. Our cloud service provider is taking care of all of our availability concerns. We don't need a plan. Plans are important, and we need to go through these plans and ensure that, because the cloud is new, we should be testing these plans because they're not our traditional test. Sometimes the traditional test in the cloud provides you some results that aren't necessarily the same as our traditional responses. So particularly, we'll talk about this a little bit later, where a basic test of, well, we're just going to move from one region to another in the cloud resulted in those images not being available in that other cloud because of licensing issues. And that was an interesting result that I actually got to watch. So, you know, again, people are, you know, this disruption of the cloud, saying that everything is in the cloud, nothing is at risk. I don't have issues with ransomware. I don't have issues with really malware because things are in the cloud. And then so we look at this, and there's a risk that comes up very specifically from those deployment models. Everything's in the cloud, but it depends what cloud you're in. So traditionally, we think about the cloud, and it's a private cloud. You know, that's most likely what people are thinking that the cloud is, that it's private, it's only one organization. You know, and it may be managed by a third party, but most of the time it's managed by you individually as an organization. Then we have, so this is where things happen. So now we have a public cloud. You're just taking part of somebody else's computer. If you actually watch The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, it's not really a cloud. It's was the quote that started that. So it's kind of interesting that, you know, in the public cloud environment, it's owned by an unknown person. You're competing for resources. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about how there's an important concept of this, and never really thought that I would get to utilize these particular words together when talking about the cloud. But our concern is that we manage the blast radius. We talk about an explosion. We talk about the blast radius of the explosion. So in our business continuity plan, sometimes we may have to be concerned with who our neighbors are. If we are in a situation where our neighbors are being malicious and we're in a public cloud, or we're in a community cloud, they may be able to do something that is going to harm our business. It introduces another level of risk. And at that point, it's going to have to enter into our plan. Our plan is our plans for business continuity and disaster recovery. While the disaster recovery piece, when something bad happens, could be simply, we're going to spin up another instance and we will grab another resource from that public cloud provider. We need to make sure that we can spin up another instance. So it changes the way we think a little bit. So thank you, Jenna. So when we're using the cloud, basically, just like it's our new data center, it's easy to forget that there are some underlying architectural things that we need to do. How we address business continuity, disaster recovery, backups, account provisioning, administrator access, even application development. All of these things are going to change how we view that people part. Making sure that those individuals have the appropriate level of access, that they've designed their particular piece of the pie in a way that is using the cloud appropriately. And then let's talk a little bit about the whole idea about having a giant service provider. Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, they're really big, and to a certain point, we really can't be worried about that entire organization failing. Oh, can you go back, Jenna? Sorry. So we can't really, we don't really think about that organization as something that fails. So at a certain point, we get into complacency. Just the other day, I was talking to one of our clients, and he was asking me about a particular strategy. And my discussion with him was, this is great. We were talking about a particular product. And I said, that's great because it does automated testing as its final step. I said, but while it does automated testing, you still have to make sure that you're testing appropriately. And conversation ensues at that point. Why do I have to make sure? I said, because you can't always trust that on the day that you need that you'll know what to do. And his response was, yeah, that's good. I understand that now. So in the same way, cloud storage is not fire and forget. Accidents happen. We've heard a million times this year. This year we heard that a branch of the military had put 3 years ago, stored a bunch of data out on the cloud. And somehow it got marked as public. That can happen. You need to ensure that, if you're putting your backups in the cloud, you want to make sure that those backups are actually stored securely and that you're periodically taking a look at them. And I know that all of the people watching this webcast are diligent in doing those things. So again, we go back to the shared responsibility model. We're right back to what does, and I'm going to pick on Amazon for a second. What does Amazon do for me? And what do I have to do for me? So here's where architecture becomes an issue with our plan. So, again, we have software as a service, we have infrastructure as a service, and we have this imaginary thing as platform as a service. Talking to some of my colleagues, we've been talking about everything as a service. I have recently, as recently as last week, I saw disaster recovery and business continuity as a service. I'm not quite sure how that gets delivered, but I'm going to reserve my judgment on that right now. But we can, so as we see, looking at the Microsoft side of this, your customer responsibilities increase as you get further down the line. So you have software as a service, you bring your data, stick it into our platform, and we're good. But platform as a service, you have this share where you're going to start looking at how do you configure the network? How do you configure your user access? So logical access becomes part of that, which brings us to that people side of your plan. Ensuring that you have the right level of access in your plan is an important piece of your ability to continuously provide service to your clients. In the same way, when we start talking about, a private cloud or an on-prem, where we're basically using them as a data center, you have all that responsibility. So that changes your approach. So your business continuity plan must understand how you're delivering those services and act accordingly. So, and this is where that whole piece about, remember we were talking about blast radius? So if we had, and this is taken from the Cloud Security Alliance, and they're talking about, well, maybe what you want to do is you want to restrict your access to administrators based on the services, as opposed to restricting I'm sorry, Jenna, can you go forward one? So, again, this was taken from the Cloud Security Alliance. So we're talking about how your services, how a single service admin could potentially take out either one service. If we look at the left side, they're administering two different types of services. And so their influence is over those two. Now, from the people perspective, we're looking at that as that's their sphere of influence, and those services being together, there's a risk from that admin that comes up. So there's a limited blast radius at that point based on the risks introduced by that admin. In the same way, when you have single admins or super admins, or of course root accounts, and we can restrict those. There's a lot of different strategies in the cloud where we can start to restrict those based on roles and other user account information. So let's go back to, again, go back to some of the basics. A growing number of companies are using the cloud as part of their business continuity and disaster recovery piece. And what they're saying is that if our local data center has some event, earthquake, building collapse, major power failure. So as part of their plan, they're planning on doing something called essentially lift and shift. We're going to take all of our services, we're going to put them up in the cloud, and we're going to turn off our local data center access. and we will now be operating in the cloud and everything will be fine. So now we have a situation where in that particular piece, we're talking about infrastructure as a service, or possibly we're talking about platform as a service. Those traditional risks still apply. Now, because they're not leveraging the technologies in the cloud, while they're still operating, their availability is not necessarily higher. They're not using the cloud technologies in the same way that they would traditionally be used from a application that was built particularly for cloud services. And that's really the point. Right? Your architecture is important at that point and influences both your business continuity plans and then your disaster piece. This whole idea of lift and shift may be great for a short term, but again, that's that whole point of what's appropriate for your business. Is that the best model? When we look at those things and we start to really build our plans, particularly under the guidance of NIST 834, it's important that you address the issues that are reasonable and, quite honestly, that pass the smell test. Is it the right thing to do for your business, and does it smell right? So what are some of the best things that we can do? So some best practices. Use multi-factor authentication. Wherever you possibly can in the cloud, use multi-factor authentication. Because, again, you're managing that blast radius. Okay? You're ensuring that you have separate I'm going out of order here, but you're ensuring that you have separate administration accounts. Your separate administration accounts are the things that are going to save you from problems. Now, when we start talking about that people piece, ensure that you have a way to recover from the loss of a single administrator. If 9/11 taught us anything, 9/11 taught us that we have to make sure that we have the ability to recover from losing our people. And it's really kind of sad that I have to have that conversation with anyone. But it's a very real part of our society right now. But again, on a better topic, let's evaluate the applications for cloud architecture. Can my application be moved from platform as a service to software as a service? Can I leverage something? Can I use continuous integration models? Can I treat instead of having servers, and this comes up a lot, when we have servers in a data center or we have servers in infrastructure as a service, we start to treat them like pets. We're making sure that they're well. The continuous integration models, we're treating them like cattle. If there's something wrong, we just kill them off and we move on. So additionally, we have some provider-specific features that we can leverage. There's a difference between Amazon-provided services when it comes to identity management and Microsoft Azure's or Office 365, or even Google from a certain perspective. You're looking at user accounts differently in all three of those different providers. Which one fits better for your particular organization? Do you have the ability that you can say, I'm going to have these user accounts that can only access these things in these regions. Do they have user accounts that are spread across multiple regions? Can you diversify? And these are the pieces that need to get into your disaster recovery plan because they make a difference. So if we continue to plan on this,
I think we're having a lag again, Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah, got you back.
Okay, good. Thanks, Jenna.
Michael, it's happening again. Sorry, everyone, for that technical difficulty.
Well, we can. I can talk through. Hopefully, I can talk through.
You're sounding okay now.
Okay. So hopefully, I can talk through the next slide because I have lost the slides.
Okay.
On my side. So really the situation is, so now we start talking about, really that continued planning piece. Whole providers don't fail, but sometimes access to whole providers fail. Recently, we had an event that took out the availability for the US East region for AWS. So from the perspective of if you had access to AWS, or actually if you had access while the event was happening, your connection did not fail. But if you attempted to establish a new connection, you were down. So now you've lost a little bit of that control. Now, did Amazon fail? No, Amazon didn't fail. A connection into Amazon failed. So that's why organizations like the Cloud Security Alliance is saying you really don't have to build in a whole provider failing into your disaster recovery plans, because the chances of that happening are
We've got a little lag again, Michael. While we're waiting on Michael to call back in, get a better connection, let's just go to the next slide on more things to watch. As we've been talking about the importance of backups in the cloud. Backups in the cloud, things that it is still susceptible to would be unauthorized disclosure, accidental deletion, disclosure from reuse of infrastructure, and of course malware and ransomware. The topics that we keep hearing about in the news and in all breaches today. And we'll keep going while we wait for Michael. As he was just saying before about the pet versus cattle analogy, he reiterates that here again. and we're talking about regions. If you're using regions in your plan, ensure that your metastructure is configured. Ensure that your images are non-region specific. Ensure that you do not have a data sovereignty issue. Ensure that your clients do not have restrictions. And ensure that you test your plan. That is one thing you'll hear over and over and over again with business continuity and disaster recovery plans, is to test, test, test. I think can you hear
Jenna?
us, Michael? There you go.
I can hear you, and I have been talking to you for the longest time.
I had no doubt about it.
Can you go back to, let's see, can you go back? Go back? Okay, so actually we can go one more forward. I heard your description of that, and that was actually, you've done good. You've been listening. So this is the whole thing. So we're talking about backups in the cloud, right? Backups in the cloud, the unauthorized disclosure. I'm going to stick my things in an S3 bucket, and some administrator marks it public. Great. Accidental deletion. This is kind of an interesting one. I actually had it happen a couple of times where I was talking to people, and we were talking about accidental deletion. And they told me about the accidental destruction of an encryption key, which rendered their backups essentially useless. They deleted them because they deleted the key and they didn't re-encrypt their backup data. They essentially deleted their backups. So the cloud introduces some interesting things when you start talking about that, because now you have key management, which happens in a separate portion, not like the traditional, tapes, and there's no recovery from those keys once they're deleted. Disclosure from reuse of information. So this is one of those pieces with backups and your infrastructure that this is not so much a business continuity disaster recovery thing, but this is something that you just need. This is trying to get you to think about things. So if you decommission a server and it has a whole bunch of disk space, and you had information in that disk, and the cloud service provider basically says, hey, this freed up block storage now has to go to a new client. Are we sure that that block storage has been sanitized before it's delivered to a new client? Can somebody mount that and potentially see your data? And then, of course, we have the issue of malware and ransomware. So those buckets that may become public accidentally, the unauthorized disclosure piece, now we have the ability where people could actually go in and download the data and then encrypt it and send you an email saying, for $1 million, we'll decrypt your data. But Jenna did a great job. I heard her explanation. She was doing a good job. So, more things to watch. These are very backup and disaster recovery specific, okay? If you're using regions, the region portion is metastructure dependent. So you want to make sure that your management infrastructure, the metastructure, is defined and configured and is available in the particular region that you need. Again, we talked about region specific. I did have a client who attempted to move things from one region to another and found out that there were some things that were not provisioned appropriately. And here's some real big gotchas. You need to ensure that you don't have data sovereignty issues. Is it possible that you're using the cloud? Let's say you're a Canadian customer, and that particular data has data sovereignty issues, where the government says this data is not allowed to leave the confines of Canada. Well, we know that Amazon and Microsoft don't have instances or regions or availability zones in Canada. So can you use the cloud? What about your clients? Does your client say, if you are let's say you're a pharmaceutical company, or you could even be a company that develops specific software for government, Department of Defense, and they say, this data cannot leave the confines of the U.S. So those are important pieces that very often can influence your plan directly. And then here's the other thing. If you're using regions, ensure that you test everything across regions. So this is where we make sure that, there at that point, the comment here is there's no such thing as highly available, highly resilient pets. Pets are pets. They're one particular object. They're like a server in your data center. When we're dealing with the cloud, we're more looking at it like cattle. We can run the cattle off into any field we possibly want, and that cattle will be a cattle. If there's a problem with that cattle, we can get another cattle to take its place. And we just kill them off and move along. So, testing is important when we talk about those things. Okay, so we talked a little bit about that. So if you have backup in the cloud, or you're planning on using the cloud as a data center augmentation, let's make sure that you don't have any restrictions based on HIPAA, HITRUST, GDPR. GDPR influences very many pieces of your disaster recovery plan, particularly in the terms of backups, because if we have this, if a European citizen now exercises their right to be forgotten, and you have backups, they have the right to be forgotten from your backups as well. And if we have things where you're spinning them up all over in different regions or different availability zones, you have to go track those down. So understand that that will influence your daily operations, not just your disaster recovery plans. And then the other piece that is not on the slide are restrictions from organizations like Payment Card International, where we can't store payment card data in that lift and shift approach. So some organizations may feel that a lift and shift would be a great piece for their disaster recovery and business continuity, but it introduces a whole new set of compliance issues. So So I think I said the word testing 47, 48 times. You know, there's really good news when we start talking about testing, okay? Testing in the cloud, to test the technology, it's really easy. But testing your business continuity and your disaster recovery plan is so incredibly important. And so if I can share a story I asked a client if they had tested their plan, and they said they hadn't tested their plan. And I said, well, next week, can you just test your plan? Let's just test it. And so they went ahead and they did a test of their plan. And the interesting thing is that the technology portions of their test were perfect. They did find that they had no way to communicate with one another because they had the wrong phone numbers on their contact sheet for their disaster recovery testing. So it's the little things. So with that, testing doesn't need to be a full-scale test. You don't need to shut down your entire operation and move it. You can shut down a portion. You can do a tabletop exercise. You can just go through and make sure that you understand things like, what would happen if I lost access to my building? Hurricane Sandy, or whatever we want to call that event in New York, but there were organizations that continued to run. Their facilities continued to run, but they couldn't get to the buildings. So that's part of your disaster recovery. That's part of your business continuity. Your data center is running, but I can't provide for daily care and feeding. How do I do that? So really, that situation, you sit down, like tabletop testing. Tabletop testing is a great thing, right? Use the news. So like I just talked to you about Sandy. I've had clients where I said, you know, what about flooding? What about building collapses? They said, oh, building collapsed down the street last year. I said, well, there's your event. Everybody loves a disaster story. Some of us that are old enough to remember, there was a whole series of disaster movies that did really well in the box office. I don't necessarily know why, but everybody loves a disaster story. And if you're stuck, if you're really stuck, ask for some help. To our clients, whenever they're stuck with things like that, I'm always happy to help them. So ask for some help. And I realize I've taken up much of your time, so thank you so much.
That was great, Michael. We don't have any questions coming through right now, but everyone is more than welcome to ask Michael any questions through his email on screen now. You have my email in your inbox, and I'm happy to connect you with the right people if you have more questions. I think there were some great takeaways from today's presentation, and you know, there's so much cloud information out there, so thank you for joining us today and bearing with us through our technology issues. And thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone. Have a great day.
Have a great day.